Chapter 18 of the Pit Prop Syndicate by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. The Bordeaux Lorries. 2 days later, Inspector Willis sat once again in the office of M. Max, the head of the French Excise Department in Paris. The Frenchman greeted him politely, but without enthusiasm. "Ah, monsieur," he said, "you have not received my letter? No? I wrote to your department yesterday." "It hadn't come, sir, when I left," Willis returned. "But perhaps if it is something I should know, you could tell me the contents?" "But certainly, monsieur. It is easily done. 1,000 regrets, but I fear my department will not be of much service to you." "No, sir?" Willis looked his question. "I fear not, but I shall explain." M. Max gesticulated as he talked. "After your last visit here, I send 2 of my men to Bordeaux. They make examination, but at first they see nothing suspicious. When the Girondin comes in, they determine to test your idea of the brandy loading. They go in a boat to the wharf at night. They pull in between the rows of piles. They find the spaces between the tree trunks which you have described. They know there must be a cellar behind. They hide close by. They see the porthole lighted up. They watch the pipe go in, all exactly as you have said. There can be no doubt brandy is secretly loaded at the Lesque." "It seemed the likely thing, sir," Willis commented. "Ah, but it was good to think of. I wish to congratulate you on finding it out." M. Max made a little bow. "But to continue. My men wonder how the brandy reaches the sawmill. Soon they think that the lorries must bring it. They think so for 2 reasons. First, they can find no other way. The lorries are the only vehicles which approach. Nothing goes by water. There cannot be a tunnel because there is no place for the other end. There remains only the lorries. Second, they think it is the lorries because the drivers changed the numbers. It is suspicious, is it not? Yes? You understand me?" "Perfectly, sir." "Good. My men then watch the lorries. They get help from the police at Bordeaux. They find the firewood trade is a nothing." M. Max shrugged his shoulders. "There are 5 firms to which the lorries go, and of the 5, 4—" his gesture indicated a despair too deep for words. "To serve them, it is but a blind. So my men think. But the 5th firm, it is that of Raymond Fils, one of the biggest distilleries of Bordeaux. That Raymond Fils are sending out the brandy suggests itself to my men. At last the affair marches." M. Max paused, and Willis bowed to signify his appreciation of the point. "My men visit Raymond Fils. They search into everything. They find the law is not broken. All is in order. They are satisfied." "But, sir, if these people are smuggling brandy into England—" Willis was beginning when the other interrupted him. "But yes, monsieur, I grasp your point. I speak of French law. It is different from yours. Here duty is not charged on just so much spirit as is distilled. We grant the distiller a license, and it allows him to distill any quantity up to the figure the license bears. But, monsieur, Raymond Fils are—how do you say it?—well within their limit, yes? They do not break the French law." "Therefore, sir, you mean you cannot help me further?" "My dear monsieur, what would you? I have done my best for you. I make inquiries. The matter is not for me. With the most excellent wish to assist, what more can I?" Willis, realizing he could get no more, rose. "Nothing, sir, except to accept on my own part and that of my department our hearty thanks for what you have done. I can assure you, sir, I quite understand your position, and I greatly appreciate your kindness." M. Max also had risen. He politely repeated his regrets, and with mutual compliments the 2 men parted. Willis had once spent a holiday in Paris, and he was slightly acquainted with the city. He strolled on through the busy streets, brilliant in the pale autumn sunlight, until he reached the Grand Boulevard. There, entering a café, he sat down, called for a bock, and settled himself to consider his next step. The position created by M. Max's action was disconcerting. Willis felt himself stranded, literally a stranger in a strange land, sent to carry out an investigation among a people whose language he could not even speak. He saw at once that his task was impossible. He must have local help or he could proceed no further. He thought of his own department. The excise had failed him. What about the Sûreté? But a very little thought convinced him that he was even less likely to obtain help from this quarter. He could only base an appeal on the possibility of a future charge of conspiracy to murder, and he realized that the evidence for that was too slight to put forward seriously. What was to be done? So far as he could see but one thing: he must employ a private detective. This plan would meet the language difficulty by which he was so completely hung up. He went to a call office and got his chief at the Yard on the long-distance wire. The latter approved his suggestion, and recommended M. Jules Laroche, of the Rue de Sommerard, near the Sorbonne. Half an hour later Willis reached the house. M. Laroche proved to be a tall, unobtrusive-looking man of some 45, who had lived in London for some years and spoke as good English as Willis himself. He listened quietly and without much apparent interest to what his visitor had to tell him, then said he would be glad to take on the job. "We had better go to Bordeaux this evening, so as to start fresh tomorrow," Willis suggested. "2 o'clock at the d'Orsay station," the other returned. "We have just time. We can settle our plans on the train." They reached the St. Jean station at Bordeaux at 10:35 that night, and drove to the Hôtel d'Espagne. They had decided that they could do nothing until the following evening, when they would go out to the clearing and see what a search of the mill premises might reveal. Next morning Laroche vanished, saying he had friends in the town whom he wished to look up, and it was close on dinner time before he put in an appearance. "I have got some information that may help," he said, as Willis greeted him. "Though I'm not connected with the official force, we are very good friends, and have worked into each other's hands. I happen to know one of the officers of the local police, and he got me the information. It seems that a M. Pierre Raymond is practically the owner of Raymond Fills, the distillers you mentioned. He is a man of about 30, and the son of one of the original brothers. He was at one time comfortably off, and lived in a pleasant villa in the suburbs, but latterly he has been going the place, and within the last 2 years he let his villa and bought a tiny house next door to the distillery, where he is now living. It is believed his money went at Monte Carlo. Indeed, it seems he is a wrong 'un all round. At all events, he is known to be hard up now." "And do you think he moved in so that he could help load up that brandy at night?" "That's what I think," Laroche admitted. "You see, there is the motive for it as well. He wouldn't join the syndicate unless he was in difficulties. I fancy M. Pierre Raymond will be an interesting study." Willis nodded. The suggestion was worth investigation, and he congratulated himself on getting hold of so excellent a colleague as this Laroche seemed to be. The Frenchman during the day had hired a motor bicycle and side car, and as dusk began to fall the two men left their hotel and ran out along the Bayonne road until they reached the Lesque. There they hid their vehicles behind some shrubs, and, reaching the end of the lane, turned down it. It was pitch dark among the trees, and they had some difficulty in keeping the track until they reached the clearing. There a quarter moon rendered objects dimly visible, and Willis at once recognized his surroundings from the description he had received from Hilliard and Merriman. "You see, somebody is in the manager's house," he whispered, pointing to a light which gleamed in the window. "If Henri has taken over Coburn's job, he may go down to the mill as Coburn did. Hadn't we better wait and see?" The Frenchman agreeing, they moved round the fringe of trees at the edge of the clearing, just as Merriman had done on a similar occasion some 7 weeks earlier, and as they crouched in the shelter of a clump of bushes in front of the house, they might have been interested to know that it was from these same shrubs that disconsolate sentimentalist had lain dreaming of his lady love, and from which he had witnessed her father's stealthy journey to the mill. It was a good deal colder to-night than on that earlier occasion, when watch was kept on the lonely house. The two men shivered as they drew their collars higher round their necks and crouched down to get shelter from the bitter wind. They had resigned themselves to a weary vigil, during which they dared not even smoke. But they had not to wait so long after all. About 10 the light went out in the window, and not 5 minutes later they saw a man appear at the side door and walk towards the mill. They could not see his features, though Willis assumed he was Henri. 20 minutes later they watched him return, and then all once more was still. "We had better give him an hour to get to bed," Willis whispered. "If he were to look out, it wouldn't do for him to see 2 detectives roaming about his beloved clearing." "We might go at 11," Laroche proposed, and so they did. Keeping as much as possible in the shelter of the bushes, they approached the mill. Willis had got a sketch plan of the building from Merriman, and he moved round to the office door. His bent wire proved as efficacious with French locks as with English, and in a few moments they stood within, with the door shut behind them. "Now," said Willis, carefully shading the beam of his electric torch, "let's see those lorries first of all." As has already been stated, the garage was next to the office, and passing through the communicating door, the two men found 5 of the ponderous vehicles therein. A moment's examination of the number plates showed that on all the machines the figures were separate from the remainder of the lettering, being carried on small brass plates which dropped vertically into place through slots in the main castings. But the joint at each side of the number was not conspicuous because similar vertical lines were cut into the brass between each letter of the whole legend. "That's good," Laroche observed. "Make it a thing unnoticeable by multiplying it." Of the 5 lorries, 2 were loaded with firewood and 3 empty. The men moved round, examining them with their torches. "Hallo!" Laroche called suddenly in a low voice. "What have we here, Willis?" The inspector crossed over to the other, who was pointing to the granolithic floor in front of him. One of the empty lorries was close to the office wall, and the Frenchman stood between the two. On the floor were 3 drops of some liquid. "Can you smell them?" he inquired. Willis knelt down and sniffed, then slowly got up again. "Good man," he said, with a trace of excitement in his manner. "It's brandy right enough." "Yus," returned the other. "Security has made our nocturnal friend careless. The stuff must have come from this lorry, I fancy." They turned to the vehicle and examined it eagerly. For some time they could see nothing remarkable, but presently it gave up its secret. The deck was double. Beneath it was a hollow space some 6 feet by 9 long, and not less than 3 inches deep. And not only so, this hollow space continued up under the unusually large and wide driver's seat, save for a tiny receptacle for petrol. In a word, the whole top of the machine was a vast secret tank. The men began measuring and calculating, and they soon found that no less than 150 gallons of liquid could be carried therein. 150 gallons of brandy per trip!" Willis ejaculated. "Lord! It's no wonder they make it pay." They next tackled the problem of how the tank was filled and emptied, and at their last perseverance was rewarded. Behind the left trailing wheel, under the framing, was a small hinged door about 6 inches square and fastened by a spring operated by a mock rivet head. This being opened, revealed a cavity containing a pipe connected to the tank and fitted with a stopcock and the half of a union coupling. "The pipe which connects with that can't be far away," Laroche suggested. "We might have to look round for it." The obvious place was the wall of the office, which ran not more than 3 feet from the vehicle. It was finished with vertical tongued and V-jointed sheeting, and a comparatively short search revealed the loose board the detectives were by this time expecting. Behind it was concealed a pipe, jointed concertina-wise, and ending in the other half of the union coupling. It was evident the joints would allow the half coupling to be pulled out and connect with that on the lorry. The pipe ran down through the floor, showing that the lorry could be emptied by gravity. "A good safe scheme," Laroche commented. "If I had seen that lorry 100 times, I should never have suspected a tank. It's well designed." They turned to examine the other vehicles. All 4 were identical in appearance with the first, but all were strictly what they seemed, containing no secret receptacles. "Merriman said they had 6 lorries," Willis remarked. "I wonder where the 6th is." "At the distillery, don't you think?" the Frenchman returned. "Those drops prove that manager fellow has just been unloading this one. I expect he does it every night, but if so, Raymond must load a vehicle every night too." "That's true. We may assume the job is done every night because Merriman watched Coburn come down here 3 nights running. It was certainly to unload the lorry." "Doubtless, and he probably came at 2 in the morning on account of his daughter." "That means there are 2 tank lorries," Willis went on, continuing his own line of thought. "I say, Laroche, let's mark this one so that we may know it again." They made tiny scratches on the paint at each corner of the big vehicle. Then Willis turned back to the office. "I'd like to find that cellar while we're here," he remarked. "We know there is a cellar, for those customs men saw the Girondin loaded from it. We might have to look round for the entrance." Then ensued a search similar to that which Willis had carried out in the depot at Ferriby, except that in this case they found what they were looking for in a much shorter time. In the office was a flat, roll-topped desk with the usual set of drawers at each side of the central knee-well, and when Willis found it was clamped to the floor, he felt he need go no further. On the ground, in the knee well, and projecting out towards the revolving chair in front, was a mat. Willis raised it, and at once observed a joint across the boards where, in ordinary circumstances, no joint should be. He fumbled and pressed and pulled, and in a couple of minutes he had the satisfaction of seeing the floor under the well rise and reveal the head of a ladder leading down into the darkness below. "Here we are," he called softly to Laroche, who was searching at the other side of the room. The cellar into which the two detectives descended was lined with timber like that at Ferriby. Indeed, the two were identical, except that only one passage, that under the wharf, led out of this one. It contained a similar large tun with a pipe leading down the passage under the wharf, on which was a pump. The only difference was in the connection of the pipes. At Ferriby, the pump conveyed from the wharf to the tun; here it was from the tun to the wharf. The pipe from the garage came down through the ceiling and ran direct into the tun. The two men walked down the passage towards the river. Here also the arrangement was the same as at Ferriby, and they remained only long enough for Willis to point out to the Frenchman how the loading apparatus was worked. "Well," said the former as they returned to the office, "that's not so bad for one day. I suppose it's all we can do here. If we can learn as much at that distillery, we shall soon have all we want." Laroche pointed to a chair. "Sit down a moment," he invited. "I've been thinking over that plan we discussed in the train, of searching the distillery at night, and I don't like it. There are too many people about, and we are nearly certain to be seen. It's quite different from working a place like this." "Quite," Willis answered rather testily. "I don't like it either, but what can we do?" "I'll tell you what I should do." Laroche leaned forward and checked his points on his fingers. "That lorry had just been unloaded. It's empty now, and if our theory is correct, it will be taken to the distillery tomorrow and left there overnight to be filled up again. Isn't that so?" Willis nodded impatiently, and the other went on. "Now, it is clear that no one can fill up that tank without leaving fingerprints on the pipe connections in that secret box. Suppose we clean those surfaces now, and suppose we come back here the night after tomorrow before the man here unloads, we could get the prints of the person who filled up in the distillery." "Well?" Willis asked sharply. "And how would that help us?" "This way. Tomorrow you will be an English distiller with a forest you could get cheap near your works. You have an idea of running your stills on wood fires. You naturally call to see how M. Raymond does it, and you get shown over his works. You have prepared a plan of your proposals. You hand it to him when he can't put it down on a desk. He holds it between his fingers and thumb and eventually returns it to you. You go home and use powder. You have his fingerprints. You compare the two sets." Willis was impressed. The plan was simple, and it promised to gain for them all the information they required without recourse to a hazardous nocturnal visit to the distillery. But he wished he had thought of it himself. "We might try it," he admitted without enthusiasm. "It couldn't do much harm anyway." They returned to the garage, opened the secret lid beneath the lorry, and with a cloth moistened with petrol, cleaned the fittings. Then, after a look round to make sure that nothing had been disturbed, they let themselves out of the shed, regained the lane and their machine, and some 40 minutes later were in Bordeaux. On reconsideration, they decided that as Raymond might have obtained Willis's description from Captain Beamish, it would be wiser for Laroche to visit the distillery. Next morning, therefore, the latter bought a small writing block, and taking an inside leaf, which he carefully avoided touching with his hands, he drew a cross-section of a wood-burning firebox copied from an illustration in a book of reference in the city library, at the same time reading up the subject so as to be able to talk on it without giving himself away. Then he set out on his mission. In a couple hours he returned. "Got that all right," he exclaimed as he rejoined the inspector. "I went and saw the fellow, said I was going to start a distillery in the Ardennes where there was plenty of wood, and wanted to see his plant. He was very civil and took me round and showed me everything. There is a shed there above the still furnaces with hoppers for the firewood to go down, and in it was standing the lorry. The lorry. I saw our marks on the corner. It was loaded with firewood, and he explained that it would be emptied last thing before the day shift left, so as to do the stills during the night. Well, I got a general look round the concern, and I found that the large tuns which contained the finished brandy were just at the back of the wall of the shed where the lorry was standing. So it is easy to see what happens. Evidently there is a pipe through the wall, and Raymond comes down at night and fills up the lorry." "And did you get his fingerprints?" "Have 'em here." Locking the door of their private room, Laroche took from his pocket the sketch he had made. He held this up quite satisfactorily, he went on, and there should be good prints. Willis had meanwhile spread a newspaper on the table and taken from his suitcase a small bottle of powdered lamp-black and a camel's hair brush. Laying the sketch on the newspaper, he gently brushed some of the black powder over it, blowing off the surplus. To the satisfaction of both men, there showed up near the left bottom corner the distinct mark of a left thumb. Now the other side. Willis turned the paper and repeated the operation on the back. There he got prints of a left fore and second finger. "Excellent, clear prints those," Willis commented, continuing. "And now I have something to tell you. While you were away I have been thinking over this thing, and I believe I've got an idea." Laroche looked interested, and the other went on slowly. "There are two brandy-carrying lorries. Every night one of these lies at the distillery and the other is at the clearing. One is being loaded and the other unloaded, and every day the two change places. Now, we may take it that neither of those lorries is sent to any other place in town, lest the brandy tanks might be discovered. For the same reason they probably only make the one run mentioned per day. Is that right so far?" "I should think so," Laroche replied cautiously. "Very well. Let us suppose these two lorries are numbers 1 and 2. Number 1 goes to the distillery, say every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and returns on the other 3 days, while number 2 does vice versa, 1 trip each day, remember. And this goes on day after day, week after week, month after month. Now, is it too much to assume that sooner or later someone is bound to notice this? Some worker at the clearing or the distillery? Some policeman on his beat? Some clerk at a window overlooking the route? And if anyone notices it, will he not wonder why it always happens that these two lorries go to this one place and to no other, while the syndicate has 6 lorries altogether trading into the town? And if this observer should mention his discovery to someone who could put 2 and 2 together, suspicion might be aroused, investigation undertaken, and presently the syndicate is up a tree. Now do you see what I'm getting at?" Laroche had been listening eagerly, and now he made a sudden gesture. "But of course," he cried delightedly, "the changing of the numbers." "The changing of the numbers," Willis repeated. "At least it looks like that to me. Number 1 does the Monday run to the distillery. They change the number plate, and number 4 does it on Wednesday, while number 1 runs to some other establishment where it can be freely examined by anyone who is interested. How does that strike you?" "You have got it. You have certainly got it." Laroche was more enthusiastic than the inspector had before seen him. "It's what you call a cute scheme, quite on par with the rest of the business. They didn't leave much to chance, these. And yet it was this very precaution that gave them away." "No doubt, but that was an accident." "You can't," said the Frenchman sententiously, "make anything completely watertight." The next night they went out to the clearing, and as soon as it was dark once more entered the shed. There, with more powder—white this time—they tested the tank lorry for finger marks. As had hoped, there were several on the secret fittings, among others a clear print of a left thumb on the rivet head of the spring. A moment's examination only was necessary. The prints were those of M. Pierre Raymond. Once again Inspector Willis felt that he ought to have completed his case, and once again second thoughts showed him that he was as far away from that desired end as ever. He had been trying to find accomplices in the murder of Coburn, and by a curious perversity, instead of finding them, he had bit by bit solved the mystery of the Pit Prop Syndicate. He had shown, firstly, that they were smuggling brandy, and secondly, how they were doing it. For that he would no doubt get a reward, but such was not his aim. What he wanted was to complete his own case and get the approval of his own superiors and bring promotion nearer. And in this he had failed. For hours he pondered over the problem, then suddenly an idea which seemed promising flashed into his mind. He thought it over with the utmost care, and finally decided that in the absence of something better he must try it. In the morning the two men travelled to Paris, and Willis, there taking leave of his colleague, crossed to London, and an hour later was with his chief at the Yard. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Pit Prop Syndicate by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Willis Spreads His Net. Though Inspector Willis had spent so much time out of London in his following up of the case, he had by no means lost sight of Madeline Coburn and Merriman. The girl, he knew, was still staying with her aunt at Eastbourne, and the local police authorities, from whom he got his information, believed that her youth and health were reasserting themselves, and that she was rapidly recovering from the shock of her father's tragic death. Merriman haunted the town. He practically lived at the George, going up and down daily to his office, and spending as many of his evenings and his Sundays at Mrs. Luttrell's as he dared. But though the young man had worn himself almost to a shadow by his efforts, he felt that the realization of his hopes were as far off as ever. Madeline had told him that she would not marry him until the mystery of her father's murder was cleared up and the guilty parties brought to justice, and he was becoming more and more afraid that she would keep her word. In vain he implored her to consider the living rather than the dead, and not to wreck his life and her own for what, after all, was but a sentiment. But though she listened to his entreaties, and was always kind and gentle, she remained inflexible in her resolve. Merriman felt that his only plan, failing the discovery of Mr. Coburn's assassin, was unobtrusively to keep as much as possible in her company, in the hope that she would grow accustomed to his presences, and perhaps in time come to need it. Under these circumstances his anxiety as to the progress of the case was very great, and on several occasions he had written to Willis asking him how his inquiry was going on. But the inspector had not been communicative, and Merriman had no idea how matters actually stood. It was therefore with feelings of pleasurable anticipation that he received a telephone call from Willis at Scotland Yard. "I have just returned from Bordeaux," the inspector said, "and I am anxious to have a chat with Miss Coburn on some points that have arisen. I should be glad of your presence also, if possible. Can you arrange an interview?" "Do you want her to come to town?" "Not necessarily. I will go to Eastbourne if more convenient. But our meeting must be kept strictly secret. The syndicate must not get to know." Merriman felt excitement and hope rising within him. "Better go to Eastbourne, then," he advised. "Come down with me tonight by the 5:20 from Victoria." "No," Willis answered, "we mustn't be seen together. I shall meet you at the corner of the Grand Parade and Carlisle Road at 9 o'clock." This being agreed on, both men began to make their arrangements. In Merriman's case, these consisted in throwing up his work at the office and taking the first train to Eastbourne. At 5 o'clock he was asking for Miss Coburn at Mrs. Luttrell's door. "Dear Madeline," he said, when he had told her this news, "you must not begin to expect things. It may mean nothing at all. Don't build on it." But soon he had made her as much excited as he was himself. He stayed for dinner, leaving shortly before 9 to keep his appointment with Willis. Both men were to return to the house, when Madeline would see them alone. Inspector Willis did not travel by Merriman's train. Instead, he caught the 5:35 to Brighton, dined there, and then slipping out of the motel, motored over to Eastbourne. Dismissing his vehicle at the Grand Hotel, he walked down the parade and found Merriman at the rendezvous. In 10 minutes they were in Mrs. Luttrell's drawing-room. "I am sorry, Miss Coburn," Willis began politely, "to intrude on you in this way, but the fact is I want your help and indirectly the help of Mr. Merriman. But it is only fair, I think, to tell you first what has transpired since we last met. I must warn you, however, that I can only do so in the strictest confidence. No whisper of what I am going to say must pass the lips of either of you." "I promise," said Merriman instantly. "And I," echoed Madeline. "I didn't require that assurance," Willis went on. "It is sufficient that you understand the gravity of the situation. Well, after the inquest I set to work." And he briefly related the story of his investigations in London and in Hull, his discoveries at Ferriby, his proof that Archer was the actual murderer, the details of the smuggling organization, and finally his suspicion that the other members of the syndicate were privy to Mr. Coburn's death, together with his failure to prove it. His two listeners heard him with eager attention, in which interest in his story was mingled with the admiration of his achievement. "So Hilliard was right about the brandy after all!" Merriman exclaimed. "He deserves some credit for that. I think he believed in it all the time, in spite of our conclusion that we had proved it impossible. By Jove, how you can be had!" Willis turned to him. "Don't be disappointed about your part in it, sir," he advised. "I consider that you and Mr. Hilliard did uncommonly well. I may tell you that I thought so much of your work that I checked nothing of what you had done." Merriman colored with pleasure. "Jolly good of you to say so, I'm sure, Inspector," he said. but I'm afraid most of the credit for that goes to Hilliard." "It was your joint work I was speaking of," Willis insisted. "But now to get on to business. As I said, my difficulty is that I suspect the members of the syndicate of complicity in Mr. Coburn's death, but I can't prove it. I've thought out a plan which may or may not produce this proof. It is in this that I want your help." "Mr. Inspector," cried Madeline reproachfully, "need you ask for it?" Willis laughed. "I don't think so, but I can't very well come in and command it, you know." "Of course you can," Madeline returned. "You know very well that in such a cause Mr. Merriman and I would do anything." "I believe it, and I am going to put you to the test. I'll tell you my idea. It has occurred to me that these people might be made to give themselves away. Suppose they had one of their private meetings to discuss the affairs of the syndicate, and that, unknown to them, witnesses could be present to overhear what was said. Would there not at least be a sporting chance that they would incriminate themselves?" "Yes," said Merriman, much interested. "Likely enough. But I don't see how you could arrange that." Willis smiled slightly. "I think it might be managed," he answered. "If a meeting were to take place, we could easily learn where it was to be held and hear what went on. But the first point is the difficulty, the question of the holding of the meeting. In the ordinary course there might be none for months. Therefore we must take steps to have one summoned. And that," he turned to Madeline, "is where I want your help." His hearers stared mystified, and Willis resumed. "Something must happen of such importance to the welfare of the syndicate that the leaders will decide that a full conference of the members is necessary. So far as I can see, you alone can cause that something to happen. I will tell you how, but I must warn you that I fear it will rake up painful memories." Madeline, her lips parted, was hanging on his words. "Go on," she said quickly. "We have settled all that." "Thank you," said Willis, taking a sheet of paper from his pocket. "I have here the draft of a letter which I want you to write to Captain Beamish. You can phrase it as you like. In fact, I want it in your own words. Read it over and you will understand." The draft ran as follows: Silverdale Road, Eastbourne. "Dear Captain Beamish, in going over some papers belonging to my late father, I learned to my surprise that he was not a salaried official of your syndicate, but a partner. It seems to me, therefore, that as his heir I am entitled to his share of the capital of the concern, or at all events to the interest on it. I have to express my astonishment that no recognition of this fact has as yet been made by the syndicate. I may say that I have also come on some notes relative to the business of the syndicate, which have filled me with anxiety and dismay, but which I do not care to refer to in detail in writing. I think I should like an interview with you to hear your explanation of these two matters and to discuss what action is to be taken with regard to them. You could perhaps find it convenient to call on me here, or I could meet you in London if you preferred it. Yours faithfully, Madeline Coburn." Madeline made a grimace as she read this letter. "Oh," she cried, "but how could I do that? I didn't find any notes, you know, and besides, it would be so dreadful, acting as a decoy." "There's something more important than that," Merriman burst in indignantly. "Do you realize, Mr. Inspector, that if Miss Coburn were to send that letter, she would put herself in very real danger?" "Not at all," Willis answered quietly. "You have not heard my whole scheme. My idea is that when Beamish gets that letter he will lay it before Archer, and they will decide that they must find out what Miss Coburn knows and get her quieted about the money. They will say, 'We didn't think she was that kind, but it's evident she is out for what she can get. Let's pay her 1,000 or 2 a year as interest on her father's alleged share. It will be a drop in the bucket to us, but it will seem a big thing to her. And that will give us a hold on keeping her silence, if she really does know anything. Then Beamish will ask Miss Coburn to meet him, probably in London. She will do so, not alone, but with some near friend, perhaps yourself, Mr. Merriman, seeing you were at the clearing and know something of the circumstances. You will be armed, and in addition I shall have a couple of men from the yard within call, say disguised as waiters, if a restaurant is chosen for the meeting. You, Miss Coburn, will come out in a new light at that meeting. You will put up a bluff. You will tell Captain Beamish you know he is smuggling brandy and that the money he offers won't meet the case at all. You must have £25,000 down paid as the value of your father's share in the concern, and in such a way as will raise no suspicion that you knew what was in progress. The interview we can go into in detail later, but it must be so arranged that Beamish will see Mr. Merriman's hand in the whole thing. On the £25,000 being paid, the incriminating notes will be handed over. You will explain that as a precautionary measure you have sent them in a sealed envelope to your solicitor, together with a statement of the whole case, with instructions to open the same afternoon if not reclaimed before that by yourself in person. Now with regard to your objection, Miss Coburn, I quite realize what an exceedingly nasty job this will be for you. In ordinary circumstances I should not suggest it. But the people against whom I ask you to act did not hesitate to lure your father into the cab in which they intended to shoot him. They did this by a show of friendliness and by playing on the trust he reposed in them, and they did it deliberately and in cold blood. You need not hesitate from nice feeling to act as I suggest in order to get justice for your father's memory." Madeline braced herself up. "I know you are right, and if there is no other way I shall not hesitate," she said. But there was a piteous look in her eyes. "And will you help me, Seymour?" She looked appealingly at her companion. Merriman demurred, on the ground that, even after taking all Willis's precautions, the girl would still be in danger, but she would not consider that aspect of the question at all, and at last he was overborne. Madeline, with her companion's help, then rewrote the letter in her own phraseology, and addressed it to Captain Beamish, care of Messrs. The Lands Pit Prop Syndicate, Ferriby, Hull. Having arranged that he would receive immediate telephonic information of a reply, Willis left the house and was driving back to Brighton. Next morning he returned to London. The Girondin, he reckoned, would reach Ferriby on the following Friday, and on the Thursday he returned to Hull. He did not want to be seen with Hunt, as he expected the latter's business would by this time be too well known. He therefore went to a different hotel, ringing up the exciseman and arranging a meeting for that evening. Hunt turned up about 9, and the two men retired to Willis's bedroom, where the inspector described his doings at Bordeaux. Then Hunt told of his discoveries since the other had left. "I've got all I want at last," he said. "You remember we both realized that those 5 houses were getting in vastly more brandy than they could possibly sell? Well, I've found out how they are getting rid of the surplus." Willis looked his question. "They are selling it round to other houses. They have 3 men doing nothing else. They go in and buy anything from a bottle up to 3 or 4 kegs, and there is always a good reason for the purchase. Usually it is that they represent a publican whose stock is just out and who wants a quantity to keep him going. But the point is that all the purchases are perfectly in order. They are openly made and the full price is paid. But, following it up, I discovered that there is afterwards a secret rebate. A small percentage of the price is refunded. This pays everyone concerned and ensures secrecy." Willis nodded. "It's well managed all through," he commented. "They deserved to succeed." "Yes, but they're not going to. All the same, my discoveries won't help you. I'm satisfied that none of these people know anything of the main conspiracy." Early on the following morning Willis was once more at work. Dawn had not completely come when he motored from the city to the end of the Ferriby lane. 10 minutes after leaving his car he was in the ruined cottage. There he unearthed his telephone from the box in which he had hidden it, and took up his old position at the window, prepared to listen in to whatever messages might pass. He had a longer vigil than on previous occasions, and it was not until nearly 4 that he saw Archer lock the door of his office and move towards the filing room. Almost immediately came Benson's voice calling, "Are you there?" They conversed, as before, for a few minutes. The Girondin, it appeared, had arrived some hours previously with a cargo of 1375. It was clear that the members of the syndicate had agreed never to mention the word gallons. It was, Willis presumed, a likely enough precaution against eavesdroppers, and he thought how much sooner both Hilliard and himself would have guessed the real nature of the conspiracy had it not been observed. Presently they came to the subject about which Willis was expecting to hear. Beamish, the manager explained, was there and wished to speak to Archer. "That you, Archer?" came in what Willis believed he recognized as the captain's voice. "I've had rather a nasty jar. A letter from Madeline Coburn. Wants Coburn's share in the affair, and hints at knowledge of what we're really up to. Reads as if she was put up to it by someone, probably that Merriman. Hold on a minute and I'll read it to you." Then followed Madeline's letter. Archer's reply was short but lurid, and Willis, notwithstanding the seriousness of the matter, could not help smiling. There was a pause, and then Archer asked, "When did you get that?" "Now, when we got in. But Benson tells me the letter has been waiting for me 3 days." "You might read it again." Beamish did so, and presently Archer went on. "In my opinion, we needn't be unduly alarmed. Of course she may know something, but I fancy it's what you say, that Merriman is getting her to put up a bluff. But it'll take thinking over. I have an appointment presently, and in any case we couldn't discuss it adequately over the telephone. We must meet. Could you come up to my house tonight?" "Yes, if you think it wise." "It's not wise, but I think we must risk it. You're not known here, but come alone. Benson shouldn't attempt it." "Right. What time?" "What about 9? I often work in the evenings, and I'm never disturbed. Come round to my study window, and I shall be there. Tap lightly. The window is on the right-hand side of the house as you come up the drive, the fourth from the corner. You can slip round to it in the shadow of the bushes, and keep on the grass the whole time." "Right. 9 o'clock, then." The switch of the telephone clicked, and presently Willis saw Archer reappear in his office. The inspector was disappointed. He had hoped that the conspirators would have completed their plans over the telephone, and that he would have nothing to do but listen to what they arranged. Now he saw that if he were to gain the information he required, it would mean a vast deal more trouble and perhaps danger as well. He felt that at all costs he must be present at the interview in Archer's study, but the more he thought about it, the more difficult the accomplishment of this seemed. He was ignorant of the plan of the house, or what hiding places, if any, there might be in the study. Nor could he think of any scheme by which he could gain admittance. Further, there was but little time in which to make inquiries or arrangements, as he could not leave his present retreat until dark, or say 6 o'clock. He saw the problem would be one of the most difficult he had ever faced. But the need for solving it was paramount, and when darkness had set in, he let himself out of the cottage and walked the mile or more to Archer's residence. It was a big square block of a house, approached by a short winding drive, on each side of which was a border of rhododendrons. The porch was in front, and the group of windows to the left of it were lighted up. The dining room, Willis imagined. He followed the directions given to Beamish, and moved round to the right, keeping well in the shadow of the shrubs. The third and fourth windows from the corner on the right side were also lighted up, and the inspector crept silently up and peeped over the sill. The blinds were drawn down, but that on the third window was not quite pulled to the bottom, and through the narrow slit remaining he could see into the room. It was empty, but evidently only for the time being, as a cheerful fire burned in the grate. Furnished as a study, everything bore the impress of wealth and culture. By looking from each end of the slot in turn, nearly all the floor area and more than half the walls became visible, and a glance showed the inspector that nowhere in his purview was there anything behind which he might conceal himself, supposing he could obtain permission. But could he obtain admission? He examined the sashes. They were of steel, hinged and opening inwards in the French manner, and were fastened by a handle which could not be turned from without. Had they been the ordinary English sashes fastened with snibs, he would have had the window open in a few seconds, but with these he could do nothing. He moved round the house examining the other windows. All were fitted with the same type of sash, and all were fastened. The front door also was shut, and though he might have been able to open it with his bent wire, he felt that to adventure himself into the hall without any idea of the interior would be too dangerous. Here, as always, he was hampered by the fact that discovery would mean the ruin of his case. Having completed the circuit of the building, he looked once more through the study window. At once he saw that his opportunity was gone. At the large desk sat Archer, busily writing. Various expedients to obtain admission to the house passed through his brain, all to be rejected as impracticable. Unless some unexpected incident occurred of which he could take advantage, he began to fear he would be unable to accomplish his plan. As by this time it was 8:30, he withdrew from the window and took up his position behind a neighboring shrub. He did not wish to be seen by Beamish, should the latter come early to the rendezvous. He had, however, to wait for more than half an hour before a dark form became vaguely visible in the faint light which shone through the study blinds. It approached the window, and a tap sounded on the glass. In a moment the blind went up, the sash opened, the figure passed through, The sash closed softly, and the blind was once more drawn down. In 3 seconds Willis was back at the sill. The slot under the blind still remained, the other window having been opened. Willis first examined the fastening of the latter in the hope of opening the sash enough to hear what was said, but to his disappointment he found it tightly closed. He had therefore to be content with observation through the slot. He watched the two men sit down at either side of the fire and light cigars. Then Beamish handed the other a paper, presumably Madeline's letter. Archer having read it twice, a discussion began. At first Archer seemed to be making some statement, to judge by the other's rapt attention and the gestures of excitement or concern which he made. But no word of the conversation reached the inspector's ears. He watched for nearly 2 hours, getting gradually more and more cramped from his stooping position and chilled by the sharp autumn air. During all that time the men talked earnestly. Then shortly after 11 they got up and approached the window. Willis retreated quickly behind his bush. The window opened softly, and Beamish stepped out to the grass, the light shining on his strong, rather lowering face. Archer leaned out of the window after him, and Willis heard him say in low tones, "Then you'll speak up at 11," to which the other nodded and silently withdrew. The window closed, the blind was lowered, and all remained silent. Willis waited for some minutes to let the captain get clear away. Then, leaving his hiding place and again keeping on the grass, he passed down the drive and out on to the road. He was profoundly disappointed. He had failed in his purpose, and the only ray of light in the immediate horizon was that last remark of Archer's. If it meant, as he presumed it did, that the men were to communicate by the secret telephone at 11 in the morning, all might not yet be lost. He might learn then what he had missed tonight. It seemed hardly worth while returning to Hull. He therefore went to the Raven Bar in Ferriby, knocked up the landlord, and by paying 4 or 5 times the proper amount, managed to get a meal and some food for the next day. Then he returned to the deserted cottage. He let himself in, closed the door behind him, and lying down on the floor with his head on his arm, fell asleep. Next morning found him back at his post at the broken window, with the telephone receiver at his ear. His surmise at the meaning of Archer's remark at the study window proved to be correct, for precisely at 11 he heard the familiar "Are you there?" which heralded a conversation. Then Beamish's voice went on. "I have talked this business over with Benson, and he makes a suggestion which I think is an improvement on our plan. He thinks we should have our general meeting in London immediately after I have interviewed Madeline Coburn. The advantage of this scheme would be that if we found she possessed really serious knowledge, we could immediately consider our next move, and I could, if necessary, see her again that night. Benson thinks I should fix up a meeting with her at, say, 10:30 or 11, that I could then join you at lunch at 1:30, after which we could discuss my report, and I could see the girl again at 4 or 5 o'clock. It seems to me a sound scheme. What do you say?" "It has advantages," Archer answered slowly. "If you both think it best, I'm quite agreeable. Where, then, should the meetings be held?" "In the case of Miss Coburn, there would be no change in our last night's arrangement. A private sitting room at the Gresham would still do excellently. If you're going to town, you could fix up some place for our own meeting, preferably close by." "Very well. I'm going up on Tuesday in any case, and I'll arrange something. I shall let Benson know, and he can tell you and the others. I think we should all go up by separate trains. I shall probably go by the 5:30 from Hull on the evening before. Let's see, when will you be in again?" "Monday week about midday, I expect. Benson could go up that morning, Bulla and I separately by the 4, and Fox, Henri, and Raymond, if he comes, by the first train next morning. How would that do?" "All right, I think. The meetings then will be on Tuesday at 11 and 11:30. Benson to give you the address of the second. We can arrange at the meeting about returning to Hull." "Right-o," Beamish answered shortly, and the conversation ended. Willis for once was greatly cheered by what he had overheard. His failure on the previous evening was evidently not going to be so serious as he had feared. He had, in spite of it, gained a knowledge of the conspirators' plans, and he chuckled with delight as he thought how excellently his ruse was working, and how completely the gang were walking into the trap which he had prepared. As far as he could see, he held all the trump cards of the situation, and if he played his hand carefully, he should undoubtedly get not only the men, but the evidence to convict them. To learn the rendezvous for the meeting of the syndicate, he would have to follow Archer to town, and shadow him as he did his business. This was Saturday, and the managing director had said he was going on the following Tuesday. From that, there would be a week until the meeting, which would give more than time to make the necessary arrangements. Willis remained in the cottage until dark that evening, then, making his way to the Ferriby station, returned to Hull. His first action on reaching the city was to send a letter to Madeline, asking her to forward Beamish's reply to him at the Yard. On Monday he began his shadowing of Archer, lest the latter should go to town that day. But the distiller made no move until the Tuesday, traveling up that morning by the 6:15 from Hull. At 12:25 they reached King's Cross. Archer leisurely left the train, and crossing the platform, stepped into a taxi and was driven away. Willis, in a second taxi, followed about 50 yards behind. The chase led westwards along the Euston Road until, turning to the left down Gower Street, the leading vehicle pulled up at the door of the Gresham Hotel in Bedford Square. Willis's taxi ran on past the other, and through the back light the inspector saw Archer alight and pass into the hotel. Stopping at a door in Bloomsbury Street, Willis sat watching. In about 5 minutes Archer reappeared, and again entering his taxi, was driven off southwards. Willis's car slid once more in behind the other, and the chase recommenced. They crossed Oxford Street, and passing down Charing Cross Road, stopped at a small foreign restaurant in a narrow lane off Cranbourne Street. Willis's taxi repeated its previous maneuver, and halted opposite a shop from where the inspector could see the other vehicle through the backlight. He thought he had all the information he needed, but there was the risk that Archer might not find the room he required at the little restaurant and have to try elsewhere. This second call lasted longer than the first, and a quarter of an hour had passed before the distiller emerged and re-entered his taxi. This time the chase was short. At the Trocadero, Archer got out, dismissed his taxi, and passed into the building. Willis, following discreetly, was in time to see the other seat himself at a table and leisurely take up the bill of fare. Believing the quarry would remain where he was for another half-hour at least, the inspector slipped unobserved out of the room, and jumping once more into his taxi, was driven back to the little restaurant off Cranbourne Street. He sent for the manager and drew him aside. "I'm Inspector Willis from Scotland Yard," he said, with a sharpness strangely at variance with his usual easy-going mode of address. "See here." He showed his credentials, at which the manager bowed obsequiously. "I am following that gentleman who was in here inquiring about a room a few minutes ago. I want to know what passed between you." The manager, who was a sly, evil-looking person, seemingly of Eastern blood, began to hedge, but Willis cut him short with scant ceremony. "Now look here, my friend," he said brusquely, "I haven't time to waste with you. That man you were talking to is wanted for murder, and what you have to decide is whether you're going to act with the police or against them. If you give us any trouble, you may find yourself in the dock as an accomplice after the fact. In any case, it's not healthy for a man in your position to run up against the police." His bluff had more effect than it might have had with an Englishman in similar circumstances, and the manager became polite and anxious to assist. Yes, the gentleman had come about a room. He had ordered lunch in a private room for a party of 7 for 1:30 on the following Tuesday. He had been very particular about the room, had insisted on seeing it, and had approved of it. It appeared the party had some business to discuss after lunch, and the gentleman had required a guarantee that they would not be interrupted. The gentleman had given his name as Mr. Hodgson. The price had been agreed on. Willis in his turn demanded to see the room, and he was led upstairs to a small and rather dark chamber, containing a fair-sized oval table surrounded by red plush chairs, a red plush sofa along one side, and a narrow sideboard along another. The walls supported tawdry and dilapidated decorations, in which beveled mirrors and faded gilding bore a prominent part. 2 large but quite worthless oil paintings hung above the fireplace and the sideboard respectively, and the window was covered with gelatine paper simulating stained glass. Inspector Willis stood surveying the scene with a frown on his brow. How on earth was he to secrete himself in this barely furnished apartment? There was not room under the sofa, still less beneath the sideboard, nor was there any adjoining room or cupboard in which he could hide, his keen ear pressed to the keyhole. It seemed to him that in this case he was doing nothing but coming against one insoluble problem after another. Ruefully he recalled the conversation in Archer's study, and he decided that, whatever it cost in time and trouble, there must be no repetition of that fiasco. He stood silently pondering over the problem, the manager obsequiously bowing and rubbing his hands. And then the idea for which he was hoping flashed into his mind. He walked to the wall behind the sideboard and struck it sharply. It rang hollow. "A partition?" he asked. "What is behind it?" "Another room, sir. A private room, same as this." "Show it to me." The other room was smaller, but otherwise similar to that they had just left. The doors of the two rooms were beside each other, leading on to the same passage. "This will do," Willis declared. "Now look here, Mr. Manager, I wish to overhear the conversation of your customers, and I may or may not wish to arrest them. You will show them up and give them lunch exactly as you have arranged. Some officers from the yard and myself will previously have hidden ourselves in here. See?" The manager nodded. "In the meantime I shall send a carpenter and have a hole made in that partition between the two rooms, a hole about 2 feet by 1, behind the upper part of that picture that hangs above the sideboard. Do you understand?" The manager wrung his hands. "Ach!" he cried. "But meine Zimmern, mine rooms, they will be destroyed." "Your rooms will be none the worse," Willis declared. "I will have the damage made good, and I shall pay you reasonably well for everything. You'll not lose if you act on the square, but if not—" he stared aggressively in the other's face, "if the slightest hint of my plan reaches any of the men, well, it will be 10 years at least." "It shall be done. All shall happen as you say." "It had better," Willis rejoined, and with a menacing look he strode out of the restaurant. "The Gresham Hotel," he called to his driver as he re-entered his taxi. His manner to the manageress of the Bedford Square Hotel was very different from that displayed to the German. Introducing himself as an inspector from the yard, he inquired the purpose of Archer's call. Without hesitation he was informed. The distiller had engaged a private sitting room for a business interview which was to take place at 11 o'clock on the following Tuesday, between a Miss Coburn, a Mr. Merriman, and a Captain Beamish. "So far so good," thought Willis exultingly as he drove off. "They're walking into the trap. I shall have them all. I shall have them in a week." At the yard he dismissed his taxi, and on reaching his room he found the letter he was expecting from Madeline. It contained that from Beamish, and the latter ran: "Ferriby, Yorks, Saturday. "Dear Miss Coburn, I have just received your letter of 25th instant, and I hasten to reply. I am deeply grieved to learn that you consider yourself badly treated by the members of the Syndicate, and I may say at once that I feel positive that any obligations which they may have contracted will be immediately and honorably discharged. It is, however, news to me that your late father was a partner, as I always imagined that he held his position as I do my own, namely as a salaried official who also receives a bonus based on the profits of the concern. With regard to the notes you have found on the operations of the Syndicate, it is obvious that these must be capable of a simple explanation, as there was nothing in the operations complicated or difficult to understand. I shall be very pleased to fall in with your suggestion that we should meet and discuss the points at issue, and I would suggest 11 a.m. on Tuesday, 10th proximo, at the Gresham Hotel in Bedford Square, if this would suit you. With kind regards, yours sincerely, Walter Beamish." Willis smiled as he read this effusion. It was really quite well worded, and left the door open for any action which the syndicate might decide on. "Ah, well, my friend," he thought grimly, "you'll get a little surprise on Tuesday. You'll find Miss Coburn is not to be caught as easily as you think. Just you wait and see." For the next 3 or 4 days Willis busied himself in preparing for his great coup. First he went down again to Eastbourne via Brighton and coached Madeline and Merriman in the part they were to play in the coming interview. Next he superintended the making of the hole through the wall dividing the 2 private rooms at the Cranbourne Street restaurant, and drilled the party of men who were to occupy the annex. To his unbounded satisfaction he found that every word uttered at the table in the larger room was audible next door to anyone standing at the aperture. Then he detailed 2 picked men to wait within call of the private room at the Gresham during the interview between Madeline and Beamish. Finally, all his preparations in London complete, he returned to Hull and set himself, by means of the secret telephone, to keep in touch with the affairs of the Syndicate. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Pit Prop Syndicate by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Double Cross. Inspector Willis spent the Saturday before the fateful Tuesday at the telephone in the empty cottage. Nothing of interest passed over the wire except that Benson informed his chief that he had had a telegram from Beamish saying that, in order to reach Ferriby at the prearranged hour, he was having to sail without a full cargo of props, and that the 2 men went over again the various trains by which they and their confederates would travel to London. Both items pleased Willis, as it showed him that the plans originally made were being adhered to. On Monday morning, as the critical hour of his coup approached, he became restless and even nervous, so far, that is, as an inspector of the yard on duty can be nervous. So much depended on the results of the next day and a half. His own fate hung in the balance as well as that of the men against whom he had pitted himself. Miss Coburn and Merriman, too, would be profoundly affected however the affair ended, while to his department, and even to the nation at large, his success would not be without importance. He determined he would, if possible, see the various members of the gang start, traveling himself in the train with Archer as the leader and the man most urgently wanted. Benson, he remembered, was to go first. Willis therefore haunted the Paragon station, watching the trains leave, and he was well satisfied when he saw Benson get on board the 9:10 a.m. By means of a word of explanation and the passing of a couple of shillings, he induced an official to examine the traveller's ticket, which proved to be a third return to King's Cross. Beamish and Bulla were to travel by the 4 p.m., and Willis, carefully disguised as a deep-sea fisherman, watched them arrive separately, take their tickets, and enter the train. Beamish travelled first and Bulla third, and again the inspector had their tickets examined and found they were for London. Archer was to leave at 5:30, and Willis intended, as a precautionary measure, to travel up with him and keep him under observation. Still in his fisherman's disguise, he took his own ticket, got into the rear of the train, and kept his eye on the platform until he saw Archer pass, suitcase and rug in hand. Then, cautiously looking out, he watched the other get into a through coach for King's Cross. As the train ran past the depot at Ferriby, Willis observed that the Girondin was not discharging pit props, but instead was loading casks of some kind. He had noticed on the previous Friday, when he had been in the neighborhood, that some wagons of those casks had been shunted inside the enclosure and were being unloaded by the Syndicate's men. The casks looked like those in which the crude oil for the ship's diesel engines arrived, and the fact that she was loading them unemptied, he presumed them unemptied, seemed to indicate that the pumping plant on the wharf was out of order. The 5:30 p.m. ran, with a stop at Goole, to Doncaster, where the through carriage was shunted on to one of the great expresses from the north. More from force of habit than otherwise, Willis put his head out of the window at Goole to watch if anyone should leave Archer's carriage, but no one did. At Doncaster, Willis received something of a shock. As his train drew into the station, another was just coming out, and he idly ran his eyes along the line of coaches. A figure in the corner of a third-class compartment attracted his attention. It seemed vaguely familiar, but it was already out of sight before the inspector realized that it was a likeness to Benson that had struck him. He had not seen the man's face, and at once dismissed the matter from his mind with the careless thought that everyone has his double. A moment later they pulled up at the platform. Here again he put out his head, and it was not long before he saw Archer alight and, evidently leaving his suitcase and rug to keep his seat, move slowly down the platform. There was nothing remarkable in this, as no less than 17 minutes elapsed between the arrival of the train from Hull and the departure of that from London, and through passengers frequently left their carriage while it was being shunted. At the same time Willis unostentatiously followed, and presently saw Archer vanish into the first-class refreshment room. He took up a position where he had a good view of the door, and waited for the other's reappearance. But the distiller was in no hurry. 10 minutes elapsed, and still he made no sign. The express from the north thundered in, the engine hooked off, and shunting began. The train was due out at 6:22, and now the hands of the great clock pointed to 6:19. Willis began to be perturbed. Had he missed his quarry? At 6:20 he could stand it no longer, and at risk of meeting Archer should the latter at that moment decide to leave the refreshment room, he pushed open the door and glanced in. And then he breathed freely again. Archer was sitting at a table sipping what looked like a whiskey and soda. As Willis looked, he saw him glance up at the clock, now pointing to 6:21, and calmly settle himself more comfortably in his chair. Why, the man would miss the train! Willis, with a sudden feeling of disappointment, had an impulse to run over and remind him of the hour at which it left. But he controlled himself in time, slipped back to his post of observation, and took up his watch. In a few seconds the train whistled and pulled majestically out of the station. For 15 minutes Willis waited, and then he saw the distiller leave the refreshment room and walk slowly down the platform. As Willis followed, it was clear to him that the other had deliberately allowed his train to start without him, though what his motive had been the inspector could not imagine. He now approached the booking office and apparently bought a ticket, afterwards turning back down the platform. Willis slipped into a doorway until he had passed, then, hurrying to the booking window, explained who he was and asked to what station the last comer had booked. He was told Selby, and he retreated, exasperated and puzzled beyond words. What could Archer be up to? He bought a timetable and began to study the possibilities. First he made himself clear as to the lie of the land. The main line of the great East Coast route from London to Scotland ran almost due north and south through Doncaster. 18 miles to the north was Selby, the next important station. At Selby, a line running east and west crossed the other, leading in one direction to Leeds and the west, in the other to Hull. About halfway between Selby and Hull, at a place called Staddlethorpe, a line branched off and ran southwesterly through Goole to Doncaster. Selby, Staddlethorpe, and Doncaster therefore formed a railway triangle, one of the sides of which led to Hull. From this it followed, as indeed the inspector had known, that passengers to and from Hull had 2 points of connection with the main line, either direct to Selby or through Goole to Doncaster. He began to study the trains. The first northwards was the 4 p.m. dining car express from King's Cross to Newcastle. It left Doncaster at 7:56 and reached Selby at 8:21. Would Archer travel by it? And if he did, what would be his next move? For nearly an hour Willis sat huddled up in the corner of a seat, his eye on Archer in the distance, and his mind wrestling with the problem. For nearly an hour he racked his brains without result. Then suddenly a devastating idea flashed before his consciousness, leaving him rigid with dismay. For a moment his mind refused to accept so disastrous a possibility, but as he continued to think over it, he found that one puzzling and unrelated fact after another took on a different complexion from that it had formerly borne. That, moreover, it dropped into place and became part of a connected whole. He saw now why Archer could not discuss Madeline's letter over the telephone, but was able to arrange in that way for the interview with Beamish. He understood why Archer, standing at his study window, had mentioned the call at 11 next morning. He realized that Benson's amendment was probably arranged by Archer on the previous evening. He saw why the Girondine had left the Lesque without her full cargo, and why she was loading barrels at Ferriby. He knew who it was he had seen passing in the other train as his own reached Doncaster, and he grasped for the reason for Archer's visit to Selby. In a word, he saw he had been hoaxed, fooled, carefully, systematically, and at every point. While he had been congratulating himself on the completeness with which the conspirators had been walking into his net, he had in reality been caught in theirs. He had been like a child in their hands. They had evidently been watching and countering his every step. He saw now that his tapping of the secret telephone must have been discovered, and that his enemies had used their discovery to mislead him. They must have recognized that Madeline's letter was inspired by himself and read his motives in making her send it. They had then used the telephone to make him believe they were falling into his trap, while their real plans were settled in Archer's study. What those plans were he believed he now understood. There would be no meetings in London on the following day. The meetings were designed to bring him, Willis, to the metropolis and keep him there. By tomorrow the gang, convinced that discovery was imminent, would be aboard the Girondine and on the high seas. They were, as he expressed it to himself, doing a bunk. Therefore, of necessity, the Girondine would load barreled oil to drive her to some country where Scotland Yard detectives did not flourish, and where extradition laws were of no account. Therefore she must return light, or, he suspected, empty, as there would be no time to unload. Moreover, a reason for this lightness must be given him, lest he should notice the ship sitting high out of the water and suspect. And he now knew that it was really Benson that he had seen returning to Ferriby via Goole, and that Archer was doing the same via Selby. He looked up the trains from Selby to Ferriby. There was only one. It left Selby at 9:19, 58 minutes after the Doncaster train arrived there, and reached Ferriby at 10:07. It was now getting on towards 8. He had nearly 2½ hours to make his plans. Though Willis was a little slow in thought, he was prompt in action. Feeling sure that Archer would indeed travel by the 7:56 to Selby, he relaxed his watch and went to the telephone call office. There he rang up the police station at Selby, asking for a plainclothesman and 2 constables to meet him at the train to make an arrest. Also, he asked for a fast car to be engaged to take him immediately to Ferriby. He then called up the police in Hull and had a long talk with the superintendent. Finally it was arranged that a sergeant and 12 men were to meet him on the shore at the back of the signal cabin near the Ferriby depot, with a boat and a grappling ladder for getting aboard the Girondin. This done, Willis hurried back to the platform, reaching it just as the 756 came in. He watched Archer get on board, and then himself entered another compartment. At Selby, the quarry alighted and passed along the platform toward the booking office. Willis's police training instantly revealed him to the plainclothes man, and him he instructed to follow Archer and learn to what station he booked. In a few moments the man returned to say it was Ferriby. Then, calling up the 2 constables, the 4 officers followed the distiller into the first-class waiting room, where he had taken cover. Willis walked up to him. "Archibald Charles Archer," he said impressively, "I am Inspector Willis of Scotland Yard. I have a warrant for your arrest on a charge of murdering Francis Coburn in a cab in London on September 12th last. I have to warn you that anything you say may be used in evidence." For a moment the distiller seemed so overwhelmed with surprise as to be incapable of movement. And before he could pull himself together, there was a click, and handcuffs gleamed on his wrists. Then his eyes blazed, and with the inarticulate roar of a wild beast he flung himself wildly on Willis, and, manacled as he was, attempted to seize his throat. But the struggle was brief. In a moment the other 3 men had torn him off, and he stood glaring at his adversary and uttering savage curses. "You look after him, Sergeant," Willis directed a little breathlessly, as he tried to straighten the remnants of his tie. "I must go on to Ferriby." A powerful car was waiting outside the station, and Willis, jumping in, offered the driver an extra £1 if he was at Ferriby within 50 minutes. He reckoned the distance was about 25 miles, and he thought he should maintain an average of 30 miles an hour. The night was intensely dark as the big vehicle swung out of Selby eastward bound. A slight wind blew in from the east, bearing a damp, searching cold, more trying than frost. Willis, who had left his coat in the London train, shivered as he drew the one rug the vehicle contained up round his shoulders. The road to Howden was broad and smooth, and the car made fine going. But at Howden the main road turned north, and speed on the comparatively inferior crossroads to Ferriby had to be reduced. But Willis was not dissatisfied with their progress when at 9:38, 54 minutes after leaving Selby, they pulled up in the Ferriby lane, not far from the distillery and opposite the railway signal cabin. Having arranged with the driver to run up to the main road, wait there until he heard 4 blasts on the Girondin's horn, and then make for the Syndicate's depot, the inspector dismounted, and forcing his way through the railway fence, crossed the rails and descended the low embankment on the river side. A moment later, just as he reached the shore, the form of a man loomed up dimly through the darkness. "Who is there?" asked Willis softly. "Constable Jones, sir," the figure answered. "Is that Inspector Willis? Sergeant Hobbs is here with the boats." Willis followed the other for 50 yards along the beach until they came on 2 boats, each containing half a dozen policemen. It was still very dark, and the wind blew cold and raw. The silence was broken only by the lapping of the waves on the shingle. Willis felt the night was ideal for his purpose. There was enough noise from wind and water to muffle any sounds that the men might make in getting aboard the Girondin, but not enough to prevent him overhearing any conversation which might be in progress. "We have just got here this minute, sir," the sergeant said. "I hope we haven't kept you waiting." "Just arrived myself," Willis returned. "You have 12 picked men?" "Yes, sir." "Armed?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I need not remind you all not to fire except as a last resort. What arrangements have you made for boarding?" "We have a ladder with hooks at the top for catching on the taffrail." "Your oars muffled?" "Yes, sir." "Very well. Now listen and see that you are clear about what you are to do. When we reach the ship, get your ladder into position, and I'll go up. You and the men follow. Keep beside me, Sergeant. We'll overhear what we can. When I give the signal, rush in and arrest the whole gang. Do you follow?" "Yes, sir." "Then let us get under way." They pushed off, passing like phantoms over the dark water. The ship carried a riding light, to which they steered. She was lying, Willis knew, bow upstream. The tide was flowing, and when they were close by they ceased rowing and drifted down on to her stern. There the leading boat dropped in beneath her counter, and the bowman made a painter fast to her rudder post. The second boat's painter was attached to the stern of the first, and the current swung both alongside. The men, fending off, allowed their craft to come into place without a sound. The ladder was raised and hooked on, and Willis, climbing up, stealthily raised his head above the taffrail. The port side of the ship was, as on previous occasions, in complete darkness, and Willis jerked the ladder as a signal to the others to follow him. In a few seconds the 14 men stood like shadows on the lower deck. Then Willis, tiptoeing forward, began to climb the ladder to the bridge deck just as Hilliard had done some 4 months earlier. As on that occasion, the starboard side of the ship, next to the wharf, was dimly lighted up. A light also showed in the window of the captain's cabin, from which issued the sound of voices. Willis posted his men in 2 groups at either end of the cabin, so that at a given signal they could rush round in opposite directions and reach the door. Then he and the sergeant crept forward and put their ears to the window. This time, though the glass was hooked back as before, the curtain was pulled fully across the opening, so that the men could see nothing and only partially hear what was said. Willis therefore reached in and very gradually pulled it a little aside. Fortunately, no one noticed the movement, and the talk continued uninterruptedly. The inspector could now see in. 5 men were squeezed round the tiny table. Beamish and Bulla sat along one side, directly facing him. At the end was Fox. The remaining 2 had their backs to the window, and were, the inspector believed, Raymond and Henri. Before each man was a long tumbler of whiskey and soda, and a box of cigars lay on the table. All seemed nervous and excited, indeed as if under an intolerable strain, and kept fidgeting and looking at their watches. Conversation was evidently maintained with an effort, as a thing necessary to keep them from a complete breakdown. Raymond was speaking. "And you saw him come out?" he was asking. "Yes," Fox answered. "He came out sort of stealthy and looked around. I didn't know who it was then, but I knew no one had any business in the cottage at that hour, so I followed him to Ferriby Station. I saw his face by the lamps there." "And you knew him?" "No, but I recognized him as having been around with that excise inspector, and I guessed he was on to something." Oui, yes?" the Frenchman interrogated. "Well, naturally I told the chief. He knew who it was." "Bien! There is not, how do you say? Flies on Archer, n'est-ce pas? And then?" "The chief guessed who it was from the captain's description." Fox nodded his head at Beamish. "You met him, eh, Captain?" "He stood me a drink," the big man answered. "But what he did it for I don't know." "But how did he get wise to the telephone?" Bulla rumbled. "Can't find out," Fox replied, "but it showed he was wise to the whole affair. Then there was that letter from Miss Coburn. That gave the show away, because there could have been no papers like she said, and she couldn't have discovered anything then that she hadn't known at the clearing. Archer put Morton on to it, and he found that this Willis went down to Eastbourne one night about 2 days before the letter came. So that was that. Then he had me watch for him going to the telephone, and he has fooled him about proper. I guess he's in London now, arranging to arrest us all tomorrow." Bulla chuckled fatly. "As you say," he nodded at Raymond. "There ain't no flies on Archer, what?" "I've always thought a lot of Archer," Beamish remarked, "but I never thought so much of him as that night we drew lots for who should put Coburn out of the way. When he drew the long taper, he never as much as turned a hair. That's the last time we had a full meeting, and we never reckoned that this would be the next." At this moment a train passed going towards Hull. "There's his train," Fox cried. "He should be here soon." "How long does it take to get from the station?" Raymond inquired. "About 15 minutes," Captain Beamish answered. "We're time enough making a move." The men showed more and more nervousness, but the talk dragged on for some quarter of an hour. Suddenly from the wharf sounded the approaching footsteps of a running man. He crossed the gangway and raced up the ladder to the captain's cabin. The others sprang to their feet as the door opened and Benson appeared. "He hasn't come!" he cried excitedly. "I watched at the station and he didn't get out." Consternation showed on every face, and Beamish swore bitterly. There was a variety of comments and conjectures. "There's no other train?" "Only the express. It doesn't stop here, but it stops at Hassel on notice to the guard." "He may have missed the connection at Selby," Fox suggested. "In that case he would motor." Beamish spoke authoritatively. "I wish, Benson, you would go and ring up the Central and see if there has been any message." Willis whispered to the sergeant, who, beckoning to 2 of his men, crept hurriedly down the port ladder to the lower deck. In a moment Benson followed down the starboard or lighted side. Willis listened breathlessly above, heard what he was expecting: a sudden scuffle, a muffled cry, a faint click, and then silence. He peeped through the porthole. Fox was expounding his theory about the railway connections, and none of those within had heard the sounds. Presently the sergeant returned with his men. "Trust him up to the davit pole," he breathed in the inspector's ear. "He won't give no trouble." Willis nodded contentedly. That was 1 out of the way of 6, and he had 14 on his side. Meanwhile the men in the cabin continued anxiously discussing their leader's absence, until after a few minutes Beamish swore irritably. "Curse that fool Benson," he growled. "What the blazes is keeping him all this time? I had better go and hurry him up. If they've got hold of Archer, it's time we were out of this." Willis's hand closed on the sergeant's arm. "Same thing again, but with 3 men," he whispered. The 4 had hardly disappeared down the port ladder when Beamish left his cabin and began to descend the starboard. Willis felt that the crisis was upon him. He whispered to the remaining constables, who closed in round the cabin door, and then grasped his revolver and stood tense. Suddenly a wild commotion arose on the lower deck. There was a warning shout from Beamish, instantly muffled, a tramp of feet, a pistol shot, and the sounds of a violent struggle. For a moment there was silence in the cabin, the men gazing at each other with consternation on their faces. Then Bulla yelled, "Copped, by heck!" and with an agility hardly credible in a man of his years, whipped out a revolver and sprang out of the cabin. Instantly he was seized by 3 constables, and the 4 went swinging and lurching across the deck, Bulla fighting desperately to turn his weapon on his assailants. At the same moment Willis leaped to the door and with his automatic leveled shouted, "Hands up, all of you. You are covered from every quarter." Henri and Fox, who were next the door, obeyed as if in a stupor, but Raymond's hand flew out and a bullet whistled past the inspector's head. Instantly Willis fired, and with a scream the Frenchman staggered back. It was the work of a few seconds for the remaining constables to dash in under the inspector's pistol and handcuff the 2 men in the cabin, and Willis then turned to see how the contests on the deck were faring. But these also were over. Both Beamish and Bulla, borne down by the weight of numbers, had been secured. The inspector next turned to examine Raymond. His shot had been well aimed. The bullet had entered by the base of the man's right thumb and passed out through his wrist. His life was not in danger, but it would be many a long day before he would again fire a revolver. 4 blasts on the Girondine's horn recalled Willis's car, and when, some 3 hours later, the last batch of prisoners was safely lodged in the Hull police station, Willis began to feel that the end of his labors was at last coming in sight. The arrest supplied the inspector with fresh material on which to work. As a result of his careful investigation of the movements of the prisoners during the previous 3 years, the entire history of the Pit Prop Syndicate was unraveled, as well as the details of Coburn's murder. It seemed that the original idea of the fraud was Raymond's. He looked round for a likely English partner, selected Archer, broached the subject to him, and found him willing to go in. Soon, from his dominating personality, Archer became the leader. Details were worked out and the necessary confederates carefully chosen. Beamish and Bulla went in as partners, the 4 being bound together by their joint liability. The other 3 members were tools over whom the quartet had obtained some hold. In Coburn's case, Archer learned of the defalcations in time to make the erring cashier his victim. He met the deficit in return for a signed confession of guilt and an IOU for a sum that would have enabled the distiller to sell the other up and ruin his home and his future. An incompletely erased address in a pocket diary belonging to Beamish led Willis to a small shop on the south side of London, where he discovered an assistant who had sold a square of black serge to 2 men about the time of Coburn's murder. The salesman remembered the transaction because his customers had been unable to describe what they wanted otherwise than by the word cloth, which was not the technical name for any of his commodities. The fabric found in the cab was identical to that on the roll this man stated he had used. Moreover, he identified Beamish and Bulla as the purchasers. Willis had a routine search made of the restaurants of Soho, and at last found that in which the conspirators had held their meetings previous to the murder. There had been 2. At the first, so Willis learned from the description given by the proprietor, Coburn had been present, but not at the second. In spite of all of his efforts, he was unable to find the shop at which the pistol had been bought, but he suspected the transaction had been carried out by one of the other members of the gang, in order as far as possible to share the responsibility for the crime. On the Girondine was found the false bulkhead in Bulla's cabin, behind which was placed the hidden brandy tank. The connection for the shore pipe was concealed behind the back of the engineer's hand wash basin, which moved forward by means of a secret spring. On the Girondin was also found something over £700,000, mostly in Brazilian notes, and Benson admitted later that the plan had been to scuttle the Girondin off the coast of Bahia, take to the boats and row ashore at night, remaining in Brazil at least till the hue and cry had died down. But instead, all 7 men received heavy sentences. Archer paid for his crimes with his life. The others got terms of from 10 to 15 years each. The managers of the licensed houses in Hull were believed to have been in ignorance of the larger fraud, and to have dealt privately and individually with Archer, and they and their accomplices escaped with lighter penalties. The mysterious Morton proved to be a private detective employed by Archer. He swore positively that he had no knowledge of the real nature of the syndicate's operations, and though the judge's strictures on his conduct were severe, no evidence could be found against him, and he was not brought to trial. Inspector Willis got his desired promotion out of the case, and there was someone else who got more. About a month after the trial, in the Holy Trinity Church, Eastbourne, a wedding was solemnized. Seymour Merriman and Madeline Coburn were united in the holy bonds of matrimony, and Hilliard, assisting as best man, could not refrain from whispering in his friend's ear as they turned to leave the vestry, 3 cheers for the Pit Prop Syndicate. End of chapter 20. End of the Pit Prop Syndicate by Freeman, Wills, Crofts.